Hello, I'm so excited to be here. Thank y'all for showing up today and sharing space with me and sharing some time with me. So like Ronnie mentioned, I'm a PhD student at UCLA in the Department of Chicanx Studies, but we call it Chicanx actually. A lot of us call it that as a way to sort of move away from this gender binary, to move away from the male-female construct of thinking about Chicanidad, and we use the X to think about all types of genders and representation. So you'll see when I talk about Latinos, Chicanos, I'll just use the X instead of an A or an O. So cool. So today I'll be talking a bit about Mexican muralism from the 20th century, early 20th century. And then I want to think about the ways, some of the ways that Chicanx murals were inspired by this Mexican tradition in the mid 20th century. Mostly I'm looking at Los Angeles because that's where I'm from and that's where most of my work is. But there will be a brief consideration of some of the murals in the Central Valley. And then I really want to introduce y'all to my research. So I finished my master's in Chicano Studies in December. So I'm sort of presenting my master's thesis to y'all for your consideration, but also to think about the ways, to think about these trajectories, right? Because nothing's happening in isolation. So Mexican muralism went on to inspire Chicanx muralism. And now myself, I'm a Black Chicana. So how do we think about multiracial representation? I want to think with y'all about how do we do this work without erasing other people at the same time, right? Which I think there's a lot at stake in that. So I'll probably mostly be talking, but there's a point where I would love for y'all to chat with each other, to exchange, and just to join me in this conversation, because I think it should be fun, and if you're here, then you should be interested, right? So let's get into it. There, okay. So I want to talk about Los Tres Grandes. Have y'all heard of them? Yeah? Okay, cool. So really briefly, I want to talk about each one of them respectively, and we'll also think about how they were playing off of each other, if at all. Let's see. Their work, for the most part, their work was in the early 20th century, and a lot of times we remember them for their social realism. Do y'all know what social realism is? Yes, no? Don't be shy, all right? We're friends now. Who knows what it is? I heard someone say. Any ideas? Yeah, what do you think?
It seems like when they portray current events and social things that happen to people that are being harmed.
Absolutely, right? It's about what's happening in life now for the people who are experiencing it. Here's a really famous example of a social realist photograph. So this is a reference, if you will. Oops. There we go. And I think it's useful to think about social realism as a departure from these sort of Western traditions of what painting, wall painting, muralism should be, right? When we're thinking about still life, when we think about genre paintings or portraiture, social realism is a step away from all of those things, right? And a way to really represent oneself and one's circumstances. So do y'all see, this image should be familiar, I think, for most people. And it's really famous because the mother character, on the one hand, she's a beautiful young woman, but she looks like she's having a hard time, right? She's not having fun with her girls. She's struggling right in the thick of it. And that's really what we're getting at, right? It's not always a pleasant experience, but it's something true to the author, true to the people in those experiences. And that's sort of what gives social realism, that's what made it so powerful, I think, is because it really departed from these ideas of like Western standards of beauty, where things should be like still and quiet. A portrait is supposed to really glorify a person, whereas this image, I think we can agree, does not glorify this woman, right? It's kind of not a great moment for her. Okay. So this is, I want to talk about this one first, and some of the ways that it might be useful, some of the reasons why Diego Rivera might have wanted his audience, like what he might have wanted his audience to get from it. One is a sort of a change in consciousness, right? Because this mural was painted, it's about the history of Mexico. And it's a way of telling these histories that weren't very well known at the time, right? And part of the reason is because most of the population were illiterate, right? And when we think about that, I really want to insert this racialized component to that, right? And we've seen in different countries and different places over time that to keep a people illiterate is a way of having social control over that group of people, right? It's a way of organizing power. And so if you have a group of people who cannot read and write, to use imagery, to use color, to use narrative is a powerful way to insert consciousness about a history. It's also, we can also think about this as a way of educating people, right? Not just calling them up to action, but also being like, look, these are our histories, right? Like, this is us, this is what our people have gone through. And that's a powerful thing when, I don't know about y'all, if y'all feel like you see yourselves represented in the histories that you study, but I remember for myself, when I first started to see myself represented in histories, it was like, dang, this is dope, right? Because like my whole life, I'm like, I'm the only like Black Latina I know, and trying to figure out all of these things about our identities. And so when you finally get to see yourself represented, it can be an incredibly powerful thing, right? And so just that aspect alone is another way that social realism is really, really useful. Let's talk about this image, though. There's a lot going on in there, right? I think it's also worth mentioning that Rivera was really interested in indigenism, which is sort of this move where he really specifically wanted to move away from these like Western European standards and styles. And he wanted to represent a Mexico that was pre-contact, right? Pre-conquest. And part of the reason is because he wanted to oppose that history, right? Because a lot of times that was the history that was not just told, but celebrated, right? That was the official history that was told. And so he wanted to really push back on that. So in this like historical way, right? So that's what, on the one hand, he was doing that. But on the other hand, he was also pushing back in a very contemporary way. So he was using both the history and the current moment and pushing people to remember, like, we are an indigenous people, right? And we don't want to be erased. And so are there any aspects in this image where you see something like that playing out? Where you see a sort of reference to indigeneity or indigenism? And if so, what are they? What? Yeah. Speak up now. We can be friends. And it doesn't have to be perfect, right? It can be an impression. Maybe you don't even know why, but you have a sense of something. Yeah.
Well, I was going to mention that the soldiers kind of give him a little bit more of a just feel just
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like them there is kind of like symbolic to, like what is being done.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the indigenous people recognize these people as soldiers and they go, oh, the soldiers are bad,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of like get the impression like, oh, maybe this is going on wrong too.
I see. Yes. So the soldiers as sort of this like political move, right?
Yeah.
And representation.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. What else? Yeah.
To take
Oh,
it further, I noticed that the soldiers are in more traditional clothing,
Uh-huh.
whereas in the other half, they look like they're in a little bit more, say, European style clothing.
Okay, so on the left side.
Yeah, like on the one on the top, they seem like they have a little bit more
Ah.
European style clothing.
Up here.
And
Uh-huh.
then more on the bottom, it seems like it's a little bit more of the traditional.
Got it. Okay, yeah. So this juxtaposition, right, between a European style of dress and even thinking about how power gets played out in that versus this sort of more contemporary style of dress that might have been more popular at the time.
Could you restate what they say? Because we couldn't, I can't hear anything you say.
Sure.
Response, but not specific.
Sure, no problem. So what your classmate had mentioned was that on the left side of the image, you see up here on the top, there's some soldiers in a more traditional European garb. We can tell by some of their accolades and swords and medals and whatnot. But then in the center part of the image, we see soldiers with more contemporary style of dress that would have been worn by indigenous people at the time. And so there's a sort of juxtaposition there. And so that's maybe one way where we see a departure from a European, Eurocentric style and a more emphasis in an indigenous style. Anything else? There's one big one
I just like noticed like it seems like most of the indigenous, like the women with the children are all facing away.
on the bottom part.
Like right in the middle, like where the soldiers are at, it seems like a lot of ones with the babies on their back.
Ah,
Like they're facing away from the baby.
So,
There's like a bird right in the middle.
yes.
I don't know why it's there.
Yeah.
Kind of like random,
Okay, so the two comments were that there's some women with children and they're facing away, right? So they're not looking at us, they have their backs towards us. But then there's this eagle going on right here. Is this familiar to anybody? Yeah, right? Let's talk about this. All right, up here. Did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. Do you know what it's about?
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing? Do you want to share with us? I'm sorry. No?
Oh, that she only speaks Spanish.
Oh, okay, that's fine. It's, yes. So we have the eagle, which is,
Beans is the national bird of the
right. And what's in the eagle's mouth?
snake.
Right. What does that mean?
It's tied to an old, really old story that passed down from Mexico. It was the passing of the line, like gold medal, and basically the return of their god, he's signaled by saying like a snake in an eagle's mouth. I don't remember quite that.
Mm-hmm.
Very indigenous.
Yeah, that was great.
So it pretty much symbolizes the origination of this whole society, because legend goes that when a defeated tribe were leaving, they were exiled, and then this eagle appeared to them. This is where the city of Tenochtitlan that became the DF, or the original capital of Mexico, came, and was one of the biggest, most well-known, documented, and like the first empire of the Western civilization. And then it continued on from then on, and now we see the culmination of all these different cultures, essentially. And it's a good birth point, but the rest of everything else is stemmed from that original
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, y'all. So could you all hear that? Should I repeat? So what was said was that the eagle with the snake in its mouth is a reference to an indigenous mythology about homeland, right? It's about Tenochtitlan, which is where Mexico City, the Efe, is now, right? And so it's the story about homeland, really, where to set up home. And so we see this indigenous reference right in the front center of the image. And so that's a huge sort of symbolic reference to indigeneity that at the time, you have to remember, this was not a popular way of expressing identity, right? When you sort of this Spanish European identity was more popular and also more official. I want to keep moving. Oh, this is just a detail from the image. I wanted to just point this out because while I think there's a lot of strengths within this concept of working around indigenous motifs or indigeneity, I think one of the potential limitations is that there's this conversation around nation state or nationalism that sometimes gets really tricky, right? We'll talk about this more as we have conversations about gender and representation and power. Nationalism is not separate from those things. But I just want to keep moving so we can hit all the points for today. Okay. This is by Jose Clemente Orozco. He was actually sort of the opposite of Rivera in terms of like his interest in like a Spanish emphasis. He was more interested in, actually he was really into like Greek mythology, and he would paint a lot of people with lighter skin, with European features. And he was also really interested in this like hero narrative where you have typically one white man going to save a population of brown people. And so you kind of get a sense of that in this image. This is a representation of Father Hidalgo, who was a great advocate at the time, but also was, he doesn't look very indigenous, does he? No. Orozco also was someone who was very expressive in his use of the brush. So you'll notice that you really get a sense of the line in the brush, right? And he's painting, I think he's been said to be sort of a melancholy kind of guy, kind of a downer. And I feel, for me, that kind of comes through in the brush work, right? Not just the subject matter, but the way he uses a brush. And then the next one I want to talk about of Los Tres Grandes is Siqueiros. He was the youngest of the three, and he was interested mostly in mestizaje. Who can explain or talk about mestizaje? What does it actually translate to? What does mestizo mean? Did somebody say it? Yeah, so someone, mestizo we think of as someone who's part indigenous and part Spanish. And they were, so mestizo means, it actually translates to mixed. So we see the racial mixing between the indigenous and the Spanish to create the Mexican. And so Siqueiros was really interested in mestizaje, this sort of like process or practice of racial mixing. As a sort of like identity, but also a source of pride, right? Not choosing one over the other, but thinking of the self as a person of mixed race and using that identity as a platform. In this image, we don't really get a sense of the individuals, right? Because their faces are covered for the most part. But we know that they're really passionate about something, right? They're standing really close to each other. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of energy going on in the image. And there's a woman in this one, right? We haven't seen too many women so far. We'll definitely come back to this topic of soldaderas a little bit later, but I want to think about the ways that he's using space in this image. He's like cramming everybody up right to the front, right? So the viewer really has to take in this confrontation that's about to happen. So that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of Mexican muralism. And I think for me, one of the most important things to get out of that is the way that folks are doing social realism. So as we transition to think about Chicanx murals, I want to ask you to think about the ways that these artists are also engaging or not engaging with social realism. Have y'all seen this image before? No? This was made in 1975, I think. 78, thanks. 78. It's at Estrada Courts in East LA. It's sort of this like really famous place these days. And it was made, well, I'd love to hear what y'all think about it before I start sharing too much. Yeah.
I feel like it's very bold and in your face, you know, with the finger just pointing right back.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very strong image, right? They're taking a strong position. Yes.
Reminds me of like the Uncle Sam sort of propaganda posters.
Yeah. With the finger?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Definitely.
The same sort of straightforward message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think also what you're saying is like the text in the image is really powerful and also familiar to US propaganda. The Uncle Sam, we want you, right? What does that do when this artist sort of inverts a US, like an Americana motif and uses it within a Chicanx context?
Kind of compares like the importance of it. Like some people may think like, because right here obviously they're being told that they're not, that they are a minority.
Right.
They're trying to say they're not just like Americans are not.
Right, definitely. So by making that comparison, by pushing back, people are really actually reclaiming power, right? People are saying, we're not a minority and we're gonna contextualize it in a way that you recognize. We're gonna use your style, we're gonna use your words and flip them for our power, right? You see how that's playing out? I think that's really cool. Anything else about this one? Yeah,
I just have a question.
sure.
What's on the top left? Is that like states or yes?
Up here? I'm actually not sure. I think that's probably a letter from the artist. At the time, there were, so this work was done collaboratively. And so this would have been something that like a lot of people might have joined in on. This is obviously, this piece was restored over the years because it wouldn't look this nice from 1978. But you would see at the time a lot of people would just sort of like scrawl their hand or make a comment about when it was made and who was a part of the making of it. Again, I just want to put this in your ear to think about how social realism is playing out in these images. Okay, so this is the image from the flyer, right? And this is one of my favorites because It's so simple, but I think it's really, really powerful. So this image was made in 1968 as well. It was made in the Central Valley. Do y'all know about Teatro Campesino? It was a theater group that popped up out of Fresno, really. And they used theater as an act of resistance during this sort of like Cesar Chavez moment when people were protesting and boycotting. And so this image comes out of that group of actors. And we see on the, let's see, left side, there's a soldadera. Next to her is Emilio Zapata. Next to him is Pancho Villa. And then the next person I can't identify, so I'm not sure who this person is. But next to him is Cesar Chavez. Next to him is Risi Tijerina. And then next to him is Malcolm X. And finally, MLK. So how much history is going on here? Let's ballpark it.
A lot. They've all made a difference.
Right. But let's think about this in terms of years. How many years is this spanning, roughly? 100? So there's a lot of time and space going on in this image, right? For a very simple image, they're really representing lots of different struggles, lots of movements. They're representing racial difference, even some gender representation for las mujeres, right? But what do you think, if we think about it that way, what is this mural about? Because there's such a wide historical span, so many different figures in the mural, historical figures. What's the mural about? Oh, we'll go here and then here.
It's essentially a timeline of the combatants of oppression.
I'm sorry.
The timeline of the combatants against oppression. So different people have different causes to rise up and continue to fight against what is unjust.
Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of a historical timeline of people who are fighting against oppression.
Yeah, I was going to say that even though it's coming from a different cultural groups and years, they all kind of have the same objective.
Right. So as your classmates are mentioning, right, there's a lot of sort of different individual struggles going on. But what I want to sort of submit to you is these struggles are really not that different, right? These struggles are not happening in isolation. And when we look at the historical timeline, a lot of these struggles are happening at really similar moments, right? If we think about Cesar Chavez and Malcolm X and MLK, those are happening at a really similar timeline, right? And we even have, excuse me, documents where Cesar Chavez and MLK are sending each other letters, right? They're in ceremony with each other. And that's really powerful, I think, but those histories aren't always told that way, right? When we learn about MLK, we just learn about MLK. We don't talk about Cesar Chavez and vice versa, right? So I think one thing that I hope to do, one of my interventions, I think, is to really push those limitations and to think about these histories more in conversation with each other. Any questions or comments about this one? Okay, so I want to move on and talk about this. This was one of my favorites. Actually, my advisor at UCLA, her name is Judy Baca. This was made by her around 1971. This is for sure the earliest mural made by a woman in the Chicanx movement. The mural doesn't exist anymore. It was whitewashed in the 90s, but it was made at Hollenbeck Park, which is in East LA. And so I'll tell you a story about her. Judy graduated college, got her degree in art, And she really didn't know what to do after that, right? Like she didn't really know any other Chicanos or Chicanas who had an art degree at that in the 70s. And so she just got a job at, Department of Parks and Rec as an art teacher for, little kids and elderly or whoever would show up to the parks. And at the time, there was like a lot of gangbanging going on right there. And it wasn't a place where like women could spend a lot of time on their own, right? So she would work in classes and in community, and so that worked out. But it wasn't really a place where like a woman might just like go to hang out on her own. But Judy's such an OG that she ended up making friends with like all the gangbangers out there, and they would always call her art lady. And she's like 21 years old, right? So she's not really like a lady. She's like a young woman, like coming of age. And they would talk to her, and she would want to hear about their lives. And at some point, she wanted to have some way to engage them in the arts. And so she was asking them, because there was a lot of stabbings and a lot of violence. So she would ask them, who's somebody who like you always can trust? Who's somebody who's always holding it down for you, who's always safe for you? Like, where do you get that love from? And they would all say the same thing, mi abuelita. Mi abuelita, she's the person who holds it down for not just me, but the whole family, right? She's the one who prays for us. She's there for us. She cooks for us. That's where we get our knowledge and our sense of family. And so they decided to make this mural in honor of not just one abuelita, but this sort of idea of like abuelita-hood or abuelita-ness or whatever. And so that's what they did. And so here she is. It's like 1971. There's hella police patrolling the area. So they would have to be really careful because the police started to think that she was a gangbanger because she's hanging out with these gangsters. So she almost lost her job. And she worked with these young men, but she really wanted to get the young women in the community involved as well, which was something that like wasn't happening at the time. Like, and in order to paint something like this, you have to get up, right? You have to build scaffolding. You have to be on ladders. You can't do this from the ground. You have to get up. And that was something that at the time, like women weren't really expected to be that physical. So she was breaking all kinds of expectations, cultural, gender, and otherwise, by doing this piece. And it used to be a place where they would hold like the annual children's fair and children's theater and things like that. And it was really adored by the community thereafter. But like I mentioned, it was painted over on accident in the 90s. And there's very few images of it. So that's why this image is actually really bad. It's really pixelated because there's so few images of it. But yeah, Judy was one of the first women to do that. And I wanted to really offer this image of a dark-skinned, older brown woman, right? Made by young brown women and young brown men in the hood. I also, like one more time, I want to put it in your ear to think about social realism, like what's happening here? Is it happening here? I want to juxtapose the last image to this one. This is by David Botello, who was a part of the East Low Streetscaper mural collective. And I think there's some sort of familiar imagery or iconography from some of the earlier ones that we might have looked at, from some of the Mexican murals. Does anybody recognize anything? Seem familiar? Yes. Up here on the top? Yeah, definitely. Anything else? Yeah, we got this US flag flying high, right? Yes. Yeah, right? A very prominent part of the image. What's the story in this image? What's going on? What's the story he's telling us? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, definitely watching the telenovela. But I think the artist is laying out some of the stakes, right? What is at risk? What are the stakes in participating in maybe this like American dream?
The representation of, instead of learning the culture of their Mexican heritage, they're being Americanized, whilst very few are learning the history of Mexico.
Right.
On the left-hand side. And that's also a typical household back in the 80s. Dad's always drinking beer, mom's bringing the food, kids are watching on the floor.
Absolutely. So there's a few different things going on, right? So we see this mother serving her kids, right? So this traditional heteronormative gender role of a woman serving her children. And they're sort of consuming this, this U.S. idea about life, about love or romance, about adulthood. And it looks like maybe dad, somebody's sitting right here. And then you have these two who are vibrant, right, in these incredible colors. And I think the message is mostly clear, right? Like, we need to be learning about our histories as a way of connecting with the past, but also knowing who we are today and where our futures, what we want for the future. So this is 1975. And then I wanted to bring this in because it's always fun to like just totally mess things up with OSCO. Are y'all familiar with OSCO? No, they're an art collective that came out of East LA in the 70s. Typically people talk about them as being a group of 4, but we know that there were lots of people who worked with them over the years. And they were like the punk rock Chicanxes. So they were like, we don't want to make these murals. We want to, can I say the F word? Is that okay? We want to fuck with this idea of like Chicano muralism, right? Like we really want to play with it and push the boundaries. And so what they ended up doing was, this is Patsy Valdez, and they're just like walking down the street and they taped her with masking tape. I forget what kind of tape, but they taped her on the wall and they call it an instant mural, right? A snapshot of life, a performance, a still performance, right? And they're like, yeah, this is our mural. We have a Chicana subject, right? Against a wall. That's what it takes to make, that's what a mural is, right? So bam, instant mural. People were walking by really confused, like, is she okay? Like, girl, do you need help? Do you need us to get you out of here? Of course, she could easily remove the tape from her, but again, it was a conceptual experience, right? And they were pushing back against what a mural could be, and why people were making murals at the time. I think some of the other comments, or some of the other ways that I read this, is thinking about muralism as ephemeral, right? Murals as not things that last forever and ever. Murals typically are not protected by glass. They're not put in frames. They're outside on the walls and they get messed up over time, right? Sun damage, wind damage, rain, graffiti, pollution, bird shit, all of these things play out in the lifespan of a mural. And I think they're really calling attention to the temporality and the shortness of the life of a mural. I wanted to talk about one more. This isn't exactly a Chicano or Chicanx mural, but it is a mural by a collective of people of color in Los Angeles in a similar historical moment in 1970. It's called The Black Experience, and it's at UCLA. It's an image of a bunch of different folks who were really important historical figures for the the Black Panther group and the Black Power movement at UCLA. But if you look in here, there's like details of Angela Davis and Huey Newton, and all these people who were really significant to the movement. I point this out though because the mural was like mysteriously disappeared in 1992, right? And remember, 1992 in Los Angeles is when Rodney King, the revolt went down, right? So we have to think about these things in connection to the larger historical moment. So it disappeared in 1992, and it was like, people didn't know where it was, but it was on a wall, so, you know, go figure. And then it resurfaced on accident not too long ago, just a few years ago, and now it's displayed very proudly next to the Panda Express in the food hall or food court. But I just want to put this out there so that we can, again, begin to think about public art across racial difference, and thinking about them as not really wholly separate movements, but movements that were in conversation with each other, movements that were inspired by each other, that had similar purpose and similar results in a lot of ways. Okay, I'm actually going to move on because I feel like I'm running out of time, right? I have till 20? You have till 2:20. 2:20? Okay, I'm going to keep moving because I'm going to run out of time. So I want to fast forward. So what we've talked about so far is sort of the historical part of my research. We looked at Mexico from the 20th century. We looked at the United States from the mid-20th century. And now I want to think about emerging artistry and murals from like today, 2016, 2017, 2018. What is the future, right? This is an image of a mural design that I was a part of. So you remember I mentioned my advisor, Judy Baca? Yeah? So she's still a badass chingona making art in LA. And so as a team, we got a grant from the Department of Cultural Affairs for $30,000 to make a mural in Watts that would sort of honor and commemorate the history of the 1965 rebellion there. And not just to remember it, but to also ask, like, what's the future for Watts? What is the future going to look like? What do people imagine in Watts as the future? So this was our like rough draft, first design. That's my hand right there, my arm. But I want to give you a little historical context to what happened in Watts. Has anybody ever heard of Marquette Frye? Probably not, right? He was the Rodney King of 1965. He was the Trayvon Martin of the time. So one night he was driving home with his brother, two brothers, driving home. They were out having a drink with a couple of lady friends because Marquette had just got back from the service. He was in the, I believe he was in the Air Force, and he just got home. And so they were celebrating. And they had a drink or two. They're driving home, and they're right down the street from their mom's house. And the CHP pulls them over. And, you know, nobody really knows exactly how it went down because the versions are so different from the official police report versus what the community had said happened. But what ended up happening for sure is that the Frye family got beat up by those police, the two brothers, and then since they were so close to their mom's house, and like, let me just say, this was on August 11th. It was really, really hot. So a lot of people in the community were like, it was at night. People were like standing outside trying to cool down. Because remember in Watts, in Los Angeles, it was like hella segregated. So that was the only place where black people could live, right? So there wasn't AC. There wasn't, like houses were tiny back then. So people were hot and they were standing outside trying to cool down. So it was a ton of witnesses. And they went and told her, Mrs. Frye, your sons are in trouble. So she ran over. And the cops ended up beating her up too. Their car gets impounded. They actually never got their car back that night, like ever. And they go to court, all these things. But that's what set off the 1965 rebellion in Watts, right? And it would be a disgrace for me to say this is the reason why the rebellion broke out, right? This was the last straw as to why the rebellion broke out, right? There were a million reasons why there was so much tension in the community leading up to that point, right? I won't get into it, but we can sort of imagine some of the circumstances through segregation, lack of transportation, lack of economic opportunities, the schooling was terrible, and so on. So that's sort of the historical context to what happened in Watts. But as my project, let me just do this. As so we got this grant from the Department of Cultural Affairs, and they're like, make a mural in Watts, about Watts, for Watts. And that can be a really tricky thing, right? I'm from LA, but I didn't grow up in Watts. And people know that when I walk in the neighborhood. From lots of different ways. It's clear that I'm not from there, but I think there's a lot of similar stakes. So what we ended up doing was my homegirl Pilar and we ended up joining this group called I Heart Watts so that we could become a part of the community and we could talk to people and build with them instead of just trying to come in and be like, we know what you need, we know how you see yourselves. So we really wanted to become a part of the community, and so we spent a year working with the group, I Heart Watts, and that's me, and then that's my girl Pilar right there. And we did like all kinds of fundraisers and cleanup days and picnics, and it was really, really fun. And we worked within the confines of my project, but also outside it to continue to support the community. But one thing we found was like, it's really hard to talk to people about what it was like to grow up in the hood, right? If you're not from there. So because of the power differential, right? Because I'm a PhD student at UCLA and all these things, I can't go up to people and say, you know, what's it like in the hood for you or whatever. So we had to find ways to learn about people's experiences that wasn't like really messed up. So we came up with this thing called emoji mapping. That's where people cut out emojis and map them in space. So we had like thousands and thousands of emojis. There we go. And people could pick whichever ones they wanted. And this way people could tell us whatever they wanted, and they didn't have to tell us anything they didn't want to tell us. They could answer the questions, they could ask the questions. So we, in that way, weren't putting it on them in an uncomfortable way for folks. We did emoji mapping at a community picnic, and it was so dope because people started sharing about their lives. They started having conversations with each other like, dang, what happened on 103rd that time and last spring? Or people were asking each other like, you know, when did we meet again? Was that 1977 or 1978? So you have all these like local histories starting to play out, and it's really beautiful. It's like this storytelling experience, but also it became a geography like event, which I wasn't expecting. We weren't expecting to be talking about geography so much, but it really was important. And so that's why I selected this quote, because so I'm like training, right, as an art historian and like a woman of color scholar, but I also have become really interested in geography and the ways that geography really represent power. So we did this at a community picnic with like grown folks, and then we did it at the middle school with the kids. And it was so amazing to have these kids work with these kids and talk through the day with them. Like, what do you do in the morning? Where do you go? Do you go to church? Do you go to your grandma's house? Do you go to after school programs? Like, what do you do in your day? And they were really mapping it out, where they play basketball, where they get food, where they hear gunshots, where they see police. And while some of the stories were really hard for people to share, a lot of the students, and this was like the most profound takeaway for me, was a lot of the students ended up reflecting that doing this process of emoji mapping, they felt really proud to be from Watts. they had a sense of identity in who they are and where they come from by actually taking the time to place out how their life, locating where their life takes place, right? Okay, so stick with me. I'm going to go a little bit more into geography here. I want to just use this as a reference. This is where Watts is in Los Angeles. LA is like huge. So Watts is it's a tiny, teeny, tiny 2.12 square mile area in South LA. All right. I want to show you guys something. This is a technology that I use a lot these days. It's called T-Races. And it lets you use a map to learn about the history of redlining in a given area. Do y'all know what redlining is? Redlining is a practice that was used in the United States from like in the 1920s to about 1967, something like that. That was used to organize housing. So certain people were, so there were different grades, right? There was like blue, green, yellow, and red. And red was the worst. So if you were a person of color, you were basically going to be pushed into red communities. You couldn't get a loan. You would not be allowed to move into that neighborhood. The real estate agent would not allow it. They wouldn't even give you an application. That's how segregation, one stronghold of how segregation really played out. It was through redlining, through the Homeowners Loan Association, such that people couldn't get access to people of color couldn't get access to loans, and their white counterparts were able to access something like 98% of all federal housing loans between this like incredible number of years in the United States, which is one of the ways that we still see wealth inequality today, right? Because we know that wealth is passed down through generation, and wealth is mostly maintained through home ownership. So I want to share this document with you because when I read it the first time, it was incredibly powerful to understand not just the legal language, but the official histories that were, the ways that people were talked about. So this is a document from 1939 that's a survey of Watts. So you have, at the time, about 25% of the families were foreign or international. There was a strong Mexican and Japanese group, and also it was 50% Negro, right? But in the comments, it said that there's a subversive racial elements and encroachment of industry and business increasing. It gives other information about how much money people were making and what types of rooms and things like that. But I really want to just sort of look at this section on the bottom. Okay, so I'll start right here. This area, which is located in both county and city territory, is known as the Watts District. It contains one of the largest concentrations of Negroes in Los Angeles County. There are also Mexicans and Japanese residents, the latter usually occupying gardens, etc. Maintenance is poor of character. Population and improvements are highly heterogeneous, and while slum conditions do not yet prevail, the trend is definitely in that direction. The area is thoroughly blighted and is considered low red grade. So that's part of the history of Watts, right? Is that there was a way that it was organized by race. Oh, let me put this back. These are some of the, so once I started doing more research, I started making my own maps And this is what I found in terms of like the census data. So they use this term's Puerto Rican or Spanish surname. The darker spots are where there's higher concentration. The lighter spots are where there's lower concentration. This was the white community in the 1960s. Oops. There we go. So actually South LA was like mostly white. So places like Inglewood, Compton, Southgate, those were all white. Those were all white communities. No people of color could live there until after the 1965 revolt. And then this is Watts in the same year, right? So you get this really strong contrast that there's pretty much no white people living right here and all black people living in that same area. And so the mural that we were working on then, it became really apparent to me that there is definitely a geographical imperative to how we represent these folks, right? We have to talk about it in terms of geography. This is one of our more recent designs, although it's not the most recent design. And you have a sense of the community of Watts in space. We have a park and different housing, I don't want to say projects, but initiatives. But in the foreground, we have these kids of different races, and sort of our comment is that this is sort of the direction that we understand that Watts is moving in, based on learning from people's emoji maps, interviewing, doing the history, and understanding sort of the cultural experiences of Watts. This was sort of our interpretation of what the future might be. Our plan is to install, so it's a digital mural. So we designed it digitally. We printed it, and now we're painting on it. It's huge. It's probably bigger than this wall. I don't have the dimensions right now, but we're planning on installing it on the facade of Markham Middle School, the school where we did the workshops. And then on the floor, we're going to sandblast a map on front so that people can locate other murals and other sites of cultural interest. So where the Watts Towers are, where there's other murals and other sculptures, so people can do like a walking tour. And yeah, I wanted to sort of end on this image and ask you all, really, do you see traces of social realism? Oh, I also meant to mention one thing. So as we're working on this with my advisor, Judy Baca, there's a team of us working on it, right? So Judy is like an older woman now. She's 70 years old. She's the sort of the lead artist. I'm working on it. Pilar's working on it. We have, we're working with our team members are immigrants, undocumented and documented. We're working with, it's mostly women of color actually on our team. We do have some men, but mostly women. And so I wanted to ask you all, like, is this a Chicano mural? Is this a Chicanx mural, right? What does that mean even? What does it mean if we're trying to do a mural that's thinking about Black history, that's also in a majority Latino community now, right? Watts has been majority Latino for the past like 30 years. Our team is a group of mixed people, but there's definitely a tradition that we're pulling from. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but I'd be really curious to know what you all think. Is this a Chicano mural, a Chicana mural, Chicanx mural? Do we have elements of social realism or Afrofuturism? And any comments that you might have, because we're still doing the in-painting. So that's it, really. I just want to end with some questions.